In 1442, two young boys were taken from their home, not by bandits or kidnappers, but by one of the most powerful empires on Earth. One of those boys would become a man whose reputation grew so dark, it slipped from history into legend. Their father, a nobleman, walked straight into a political trap. He thought he was meeting the Sultan for negotiations. Instead, he watched his sons escorted away by armed guards while he was told, "Your loyalty will determine their survival." Most people picture kidnappings as chains in a basement, darkness, dirt, filth. This wasn't that. These boys were taken into an Ottoman fortress, a place with stone walls, carved archways, tiled floors, servants, scholars, and soldiers who never smiled. A palace, but also a prison. And inside those walls, the brothers were taught to read and write, but they were also whipped for disobedience, punished for hesitation, threatened with execution anytime their father stepped out of line. They slept in beds, they ate real food, and every night they fell asleep not knowing if they were going to be killed before morning. Two boys, ages 11 and 7, living under the kind of pressure that would break a grown man. At the time, nobody expected what one of those boys would become. A brilliant strategist, a merciless ruler, a master of fear, and eventually the man whose legend would reshape horror forever. But before he became that man, he was just a child in a beautiful prison, learning lessons he would one day teach the world with blood. In the mid-1400s, there was no force on Earth more feared than the Ottoman Empire. This was not a loose band of warriors. It wasn't chaos or disorder or wild invasion. The Ottomans were, well, a machine. They had elite soldiers trained from childhood, an organized tax system, fortified cities, vast trade routes, and a navy that could swallow coastlines. They had a capital empire stretching from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. For decades, they had been expanding, city by city, kingdom by kingdom, absorbing smaller rulers into their shadow. If the Ottomans wanted something from you, you didn't negotiate, you complied. That is the world that these two boys were born into. One 11 and the other 7. Both sons of a regional ruler caught between two superpowers. When the Ottoman Sultans summoned their father for a diplomatic meeting, it wasn't unusual, but in that era, summons like this carried weight. You didn't refuse one, you didn't question one, you went. He brought his sons with him. This was a sign of respect and loyalty. But the moment that they crossed into Ottoman territory, the tone shifted. What was supposed to be a meeting became a trap. Ottoman guards surrounded the children. Their father was told without ceremony, "Your loyalty will be guaranteed by their presence." In other words, your sons are now collateral. The boys were taken away immediately, separated, escorted under guard, moved deeper into the empire, miles from their homeland, their language, and their family. Not kidnapped into darkness, but taken into something far more calculated. A fortress school, part palace, part prison, designed to break children and rebuild them into tools. A place where noble hostages were reshaped. These boys had no idea yet what their future would become, but the Ottomans did. They knew exactly what hostage children turned into: diplomats, soldiers, loyal political assets, or weapons pointed back at their homeland. And what neither boy understood then was that the moment those doors closed behind them, their childhood was over. Because hostage life under the Ottomans wasn't simply confinement. It was discipline, surveillance, punishment, and a psychological pressure that never lifted. A world of tutors, guards, whispers, and the daily rituals that shaped two children into two very different men. The fortress the boys were taken to wasn't a dungeon. It wasn't a pit, not a hole in the ground, it was worse. Because it was comfortable enough to confuse you and controlled enough to break you. Inside its walls were tiled corridors, carved stone archways, guarded courtyards, high windows with no escape, and rooms lit by flickering lamps. Servants poured wine for officers. Scholars strolled through the hallways with scrolls tucked under their arms. The air was warm, structured, almost civilized. For a moment, the boys might have believed they were safe. Then the lessons began. The daily schedule was strict, punishing and designed for one purpose: to erase the boy you were and shape the tool they needed you to be. Every morning before the sun rose, guards woke them with orders. They washed under supervision, and they were marched to lessons in silence. They learned languages like Turkish, Greek, and Arabic. They learned skills like mathematics, diplomacy, and court etiquette. They were taught the laws of the empire, not so they could understand them, but so they could obey them. Meals were structured, timed, and watched. No talking unless spoken to, no questions unless permitted, and no resistance unless you wanted consequence. And there were consequences. Punishment was a part of the curriculum. A failed lesson meant beatings. Hesitation meant the whip. Disrespect meant confinement. And disobedience, that could mean days in a dark cell with only water and the threat of worse if your attitude didn't improve. And the boys learned quickly, every punishment they received was also a message to their father back home. His decisions meant their suffering, and their suffering meant his obedience. This was not an education, it was a negotiation by fear. Two brothers, two very different responses. The younger boy, only 7, adapted. He watched what pleased the guards, learned how to smile at the right time, how to obey without hesitation, and generally just how to be agreeable. He survived by becoming what they wanted him to be. The older brother, 11, didn't bend so easily. He watched, he analyzed, he understood that these men weren't teaching him to succeed. They were teaching him to submit. And he refused. He didn't fight openly. He wasn't stupid, but he resisted in ways only an intelligent child could. Memorizing everything that they taught, learning their routines, noticing when fear worked and when it didn't, and studying how men responded to pain and domination. While his younger brother was being shaped, he was being sharpened. One boy learned to live within the system, and the other was quietly learning how to tear one down. But the boys weren't told everything. They weren't told what happened back home. They weren't told who betrayed their family. And they weren't told that one of them would eventually return, and the other might not. All they knew was this: every day inside that fortress was changing them. And one day the world outside would learn exactly what the Ottomans had created. But before that day came, something happened inside the walls of the empire. Something that hardened the older boy permanently. Years passed inside the Ottoman fortress. Not many, but enough. Enough for the boys to learn the rules. Enough for them to understand the rhythms of obedience. And enough for the guards to assume the children were fully contained, shaped, softened, compliant. And for the younger boy, this was mostly true. He laughed with the tutors. He picked up the languages easily. He became something close to a favorite. But the older boy, no one could truly read him. He followed orders. He studied harder than anyone. He kept his hands folded, his eyes lowered, and his back straight. But there was something in him the guards couldn't break. A quiet stiffness. A stillness. A refusal to surrender the last piece of himself. And then came the day they tried to destroy that piece. The news arrived quietly, but the consequences were heard loudly. A messenger whispered to the officers. A scribe brought over some documents, and a guard delivered the confirmation. Word had reached the fortress. The boy's father had defied the empire, and back home, someone had acted against Ottoman interests. The punishment would be symbolic. and it would fall directly on the children, because that was the arrangement. That was the unspoken truth of being a hostage. When the father disobeyed, the sons would pay. The guards took the brothers into a courtyard. It was a walled enclosure, foreign trees growing in squares, beds of earth, sunlight reflecting off the stone like a blade. The younger boy trembled. He didn't understand. He only knew enough to be afraid. But the older boy, he didn't scream, he didn't beg. He stared at the officer in front of him, the man carrying the whip, with a kind of frozen, silent defiance. One of the tutors tried to intervene, and the guards simply pushed him away. There was no protecting the boys today. Because today's punishment wasn't about discipline. It wasn't about lessons. It wasn't even about the children. It was about sending a message across hundreds of miles, a warning wrapped in pain. The first strike hit the stone, and the boy didn't flinch. The guards weren't used to that. Most children cried before the whip touched them. Most pleaded. A lot of them broke down very quickly. But this boy, this 13-year-old, did something the officer hadn't seen before. He looked directly at the man about to hurt him, not with hatred, not with fear, but with understanding. The officer struck his back once, twice, and then a third time. The boy's teeth clenched, his knees buckled, but he refused to cry. He refused to give them the satisfaction. It wasn't bravery, it wasn't pride, it was something colder. A quiet vow forming behind his eyes, a promise. Almost as if he was saying, "You will not break me." The younger brother screamed for help, asking them to stop. He begged and pleaded, threw himself between the guards until they shoved him aside. To him, this was the worst moment of his life. A moment that would swallow him with fear. But to the older boy, this was something else. This was clarity. Because as the blows landed, as the guards carried out their message, something inside of him snapped into place. And from that moment on, the guards feared him more than he feared them. Because he would still follow their rules. He would learn their lessons. He would complete every task they put before him. Not because they controlled him, but because he was storing every detail, every technique, every principle of punishment, every method of fear. He was learning exactly how an empire breaks the will of a man. And one day he would use those lessons himself, not on children, not on hostages, but on the men who underestimated him. And this is where the transformation truly begins. The younger of the two would grow into someone pliant, charismatic, diplomatic. But the older boy, he did not become what the Ottomans intended. He became something they should have feared, something they would one day face. By the time the older boy reached his mid-teens, the Ottomans finally decided they had a use for him. Not as a warrior, nor a diplomat, and certainly not as a free man. What they needed was a pawn, because back home in the land he'd been stolen from years earlier, things had gone straight to hell. His father had been assassinated, cut down in a political ambush, and his older brother was tortured, blinded, and allegedly buried alive by nobles who wanted to erase the family line entirely. Wallachia, where he was from, had become a carcass, and two great powers, Hungary and the Ottomans, were circling it like wolves, each wanting their own puppet to sit on its broken throne. That's when the Ottomans looked at the boy they had failed to break and said, "Send him." Not as a king, not as a rightful heir, but as their candidate, their experiment, or their message. And so he returned home, but not in triumph. He didn't march in with an army. He didn't ride in as a liberator. He came in with a small escort, a handful of soldiers, envoys, and Ottoman advisors, just enough muscle to make the nobles nervous, but not enough to start a war. He stepped back into the land he barely remembered, and the people who saw him knew immediately this was not the same child who had been taken. He walked straight, spoke quietly, eyes calm, no stumbles, no hesitation. There was nothing soft left in the boy they once knew. But calm or not, he was stepping into a nightmare. Because Wallachia didn't want him. Some nobles hated the Ottomans, some hated Hungary, and others hated everyone. But most of them simply did not trust a teenager who'd spent years inside the enemy fortress. They whispered, "Is he loyal? Who controls him? Whose puppet is he? Is he even one of us anymore?" But then, the perfect moment arrived. The sitting prince of Wallachia, Hungary's chosen ruler, rode off to fight in a massive campaign against the Ottomans. He left the throne undefended, unoccupied, and unguarded. And when that prince lost the war and retreated, the Ottomans pushed the boy forward like a final chess piece. He stepped into a vacuum, and suddenly the teenager was a prince. Not through glory, not through conquest, but through timing and chaos. Through the fact that no one stronger was home to stop him. And he sat on the throne for about 2 months. That's it. 2 months of uneasy, awkward rule. 2 months of nobles side-eyeing him, whispering behind his back, and testing his limits. 2 months where he was expected to act like a ruler while never being treated as one. And then, as quickly as he rose, he was knocked straight back down. Hungary came home. Their favored prince returned. The nobles changed sides. And the boy, who had survived beatings, isolation, and psychological warfare, found himself running for his life. He fled in the night, leaving behind a throne built on sand and a homeland that had rejected him again. For the Ottomans, the experiment had failed. For the nobles, he had been a momentary inconvenience. For Hungary, simply an annoyance. No one, and I mean no one, saw the danger in letting him walk away. The boy they thought they could dismiss was the same boy who once clenched his teeth under an Ottoman whip and looked an empire in the eye without fear. He wasn't defeated. He was waiting. And the next time he returned, he wouldn't be a puppet. He wouldn't be a placeholder. He would be something else entirely. Something shaped by trauma, hardened by exile, and ready to rule through the one thing that he understood better than anyone else: consequence. For years after fleeing his homeland, the boy who had briefly worn a crown drifted from court to court, a political orphan. Hungary didn't trust him. The Ottomans no longer needed him, and the nobles who murdered his family wanted him gone. And Wallachia, well, they had already thrown him out once. But he never stopped thinking about the throne, not because he wanted power, but because he wanted justice. His kind of justice. For the father who was betrayed. For the brother who was buried alive. And for the childhood ripped away in a fortress where pain was a daily language. And all those years abroad, he watched, he learned, he listened and waited, until finally, Wallachia fractured again. The nobles turned on each other. Hungary and the Ottomans clashed over control, and the ruler who had replaced him was suddenly vulnerable. The boy, now a young man, hardened far beyond his age, saw his moment. He didn't return with a smile. He returned with a list, and this time he came with an army. Not a massive force, not a conquering wave, but enough armed men to push through into a broken kingdom and make everyone involved realize he was not the frightened teenager they dismissed years earlier. He confronted his rival directly. No speeches, no negotiations, no long drawn-out battles. He removed the man from the throne with the same precision he had once used to end his first kill when he first returned to Wallachia. By beheading. A personal execution. And then he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He wasn't going to share power. He wasn't going to tolerate dissent. And he wasn't going to forgive betrayal. His first act was not to hold court. He didn't declare new laws. He didn't rebuild anything. His first act, instead, was retribution. He summoned the nobles, the same families who had murdered his father, who had tortured Mircea, his brother, who had driven him out, and who had mocked him as a child forced into exile. They expected negotiations, apologies, diplomacy. Instead, they were met with a scene so sudden and so methodical that it left the entire country trembling. He executed them. All of them. Publicly. He had dragged them outside, struck down, and displayed for everyone to see. A warning, a message, and a declaration of intent. And for the ones he spared, the ones who swore loyalty to him, he gave them a different fate. They were marched out to the work sites, fortifications, roads, towers, sentenced to a life of labor until their hands split, their backs broke, and their breath faltered. This wasn't a punishment, it was a demonstration, a statement to anyone watching. This land has seen betrayal for too long, and it stops with me. This was only the beginning, because somewhere in those early days of his second reign, he reached back into the darkest lessons he learned inside the Ottoman fortress. The lessons about fear, obedience, and how pain controls men. He chose one method, one technique that the empire had used to terrorize its enemies, and he perfected it. Soon villages would whisper about what he did to criminals. Armies would freeze at the sight of what he had left behind, and foreign rulers would write letters calling him a demon, a monster, and a man with no soul. This moment is where the legend truly begins. After the executions and the nobles were purged, after the roads filled with the sound of shackles and forced labor, the new ruler of Wallachia turned his attention outward. Thieves, murderers, traitors, and foreign spies, anyone who threatened the fragile stability he was clawing back from the brink. He dealt with them all in the same way, a method he had learned indirectly from the empire that once held him captive, a method he refined and studied and perfected with a cold, deliberate focus. Impalement. Not as random torture, not as cruelty without purpose, as policy, as philosophy, as architecture. Because when he impaled someone, he didn't hide the body, he didn't bury it, he didn't stage it quietly. He displayed it, openly, publicly, strategically. Where the roads met, where the forests thinned, where travelers passed, and where rumors would bloom into terror. A single impalement is horrifying. Hundreds, terrifying. Thousands, it became something else entirely. A living message carved into the landscape. Obey. And the rumors spread faster than his armies. People whispered, he leaves them alive for hours. Some last until morning. He watches to see how long they can endure. He chooses the height of the stake by the severity of the crime. And he walks the fields himself. Whether these stories were true or embellished by terrified peasants didn't matter anymore. Fear doesn't need accuracy. It needs imagination, and he knew that better than anyone. Then came the moment that turned fear into legend. A group of foreign envoys arrived in Wallachia to demand tribute, taxes, gold, the usual. They walked into the throne room wearing turbans, a sign of respect in their own culture. But the ruler interpreted it differently. He asked them politely, calmly, almost pleasantly, "Why do you not remove your hats in the presence of a prince?" And they explained that it was their custom, that it would be disrespectful to remove them. And he thought for a minute, nodded thoughtfully, even smiled at the men. And then he said, "Since you will not remove your hats, I shall strengthen your customs." And then he ordered his men to nail the turbans to their skulls. Not because he hated them, not because he lost his temper, but because it was a message that my customs matter here. My throne matters here, and you will not forget it. And believe it or not, the envoys didn't die. They were escorted out, bleeding, shaking, and alive. They carried his message all the way back to their empire. And that's when his name, still unspoken in our story, began to spread like wildfire. A name whispered in campfires. A name written in letters sent to kings. A name soldiers used to frighten one another in the dark. But the peak came during the Ottoman invasion, when an entire army marched into Wallachia and found something waiting for them. Something impossible, unimaginable, and unforgettable. A forest, not of trees, but of bodies. Stakes stretching across the horizon. victims suspended like grotesque banners swaying in the wind, faces twisted in frozen agony, tens of thousands by some accounts. So many that the Ottoman soldiers stopped dead, refusing to move forward, refusing to fight, and refusing to breathe the same air as the man who had created this hellscape. And it wasn't chaos, it was arranged, organized, designed. A landscape carved with military precision for a single purpose: to break the will of an army without raising a sword. The Sultan himself is said to have stared into the night and whispered, "This man is not human." And with that, the myth was born, the legend seeded, the transformation complete. And we still haven't spoken his name. Not yet. You see, stories travel faster than armies, and by the time news of the impaled forest had reached Europe, the man behind it had become something larger than life. Princes whispered about him in letters, merchants exaggerated his cruelty to scare off thieves, foreign rulers repeated his name as a warning, almost as if saying it aloud might summon him. But inside Wallachia, inside the land he ruled with a mix of iron, discipline, and terrifying justice, people spoke his name differently, quietly, carefully, with a kind of grim respect. Because for them, he wasn't just a tyrant. He was the first ruler in years who didn't bow to Hungary, nor to the Ottomans, or to the nobles who betrayed his family. He was their hammer, but also their shield, their punishment, but their protector. A man forged by trauma, tempered by captivity, and unleashed by revenge. And his name began to change, not in official documents, not in treaties, but in whispers. He was first called the Impaler, not as an insult nor a mockery, as a description, a matter of fact. A label placed on a ruler who treated fear not as a reaction, but a weapon. But even that name didn't hold, because in the villages and forests of Romania, another title emerged, one tied to an older word, an older lineage, an older family symbol. Draculia, meaning son of the dragon, son of the devil, spawn of the order of Dracul. A name that sounded like smoke in the dark, a name that felt like a curse, a name so heavy and ominous that even those loyal to him spoke it with caution. Draculia. And it stuck. It endured, it twisted, it darkened. It slipped from truth into myth, into folklore, into horror. By the time European writers heard the name, they shortened it, sharpened it, turned it into something even more sinister sounding. Dracula. A name that would outlive kingdoms, empires, and entire civilizations. A name that would detach itself from the human being and become something else entirely. A monster, a legend, a symbol of eternal horror. But behind the name, and behind the fangs and capes and centuries of Gothic fiction, was a boy taken from his home, a prisoner in a beautiful cage, a young man shaped by betrayal, and a ruler who understood fear better than anyone alive, a man who walked through a world of blood and fire. Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler, Draculia, and Dracula. Not the vampire, not the creature of the night, the real one. And to this day, his shadow is longer than any legend that ever followed. The real Dracula died a human death, not in a castle, not in a coffin with a stake through his heart, nor due to the sunlight. He died in battle, cut down by enemies he'd spent a lifetime outsmarting, and his body disappeared soon after. Some say perhaps it was stolen by the Ottomans. Others say that it was desecrated, and some believe that it was never found at all. But in many ways, his death didn't matter, because by then his name was already alive. And centuries later, long after the stakes rotted, long after the Ottoman Empire faded, and long after Wallachia became Romania, the name resurfaced in the hands of a writer from Ireland, Bram Stoker. A man who had never stepped foot in Romania, never seen the forests that once held impaled bodies, and never witnessed the cruelty of 15th century warfare. But a man who stumbled across one crucial phrase while researching Eastern European folklore. Draculia, son of the dragon, also translated as son of the devil. And that was all he needed. He borrowed the name, he borrowed the region, and he borrowed the shadow of a ruler whose brutality had already become legend. He didn't copy the history. He rearranged it, he exaggerated it, and he twisted it into gothic horror. He added fangs, bats, immortality, and a thirst for blood. And in doing so, he resurrected a name that already terrified Europe 400 years earlier. Stoker's Dracula wasn't Vlad Draculia, not truly, but it carried his imprint. The fear, the violence, the mystery, the missing grave, and the whispers that he never fully died. And that's why the legend sticks. Because unlike the fictional vampire, eternal, elegant, and supernatural, the real Dracula was something far more unsettling. A man, a human being, made monstrous by the world around him. A boy forced into captivity. A teenager denied his home. A ruler forged by betrayal. And a name that shaped history into myth. So when we hear Dracula, we don't just hear a monster. We hear the echo of a prince who built forests of the dead, terrified empires, and carved his legacy into the soil of Eastern Europe. A legacy so powerful that fiction simply took the name and ran with it. And that is why over 5 centuries later, the world still speaks it with a shiver. Dracula.